Hi, modern world history students. Welcome to section number 12, the Armistice and the Opening of the Paris Peace Conference. We are now at the end of the First World War, which has been for us Unit 6, and we're getting into the process by which the countries that had been at war now concluded a peace treaty. So, by the end of this section, I hope that you'll be able to explain how the Armistice and the Paris Peace Conference combined to end the war. And you'll see we have these two items to know connected to that, Armistice and Paris Peace Conference. I hope you'll also be able to explain why and how President Wilson's plan for the peace settlement differed from that of the European allies. And we'll have these 5 items to know related to that concept. President Woodrow Wilson, his idea of peace without victory, Prime Minister David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom or Britain, Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. So we're starting at the top of page 18, and I'm going to review with you something that I probably taught you at the end of the previous lesson. That is, what is the meaning of an armistice? Well, an armistice is another name for a ceasefire. And the way that this works is when two armies have been slugging it out at war for a time, and it appears clear that one side is going to win and another side is going to lose, the side that is going to lose, or sometimes the side that is going to win, will suggest to the other side that they consider an armistice or a ceasefire. Now, all that means is that for a specified period of time, the two armies will stop shooting at each other. It does not mean that peace is permanently concluded. What it means is that the two armies will stop shooting each other for a specified period of time, and the hope is that during that time, the two governments then can get together and negotiate a permanent end to the war. It's awfully hard for governments to negotiate with each other if their soldiers are still shooting at each other. And so a ceasefire or an armistice opens up a window in which the armies are not shooting at each other so that the governments can begin to negotiate to try to come up with some sort of plan for a permanent end to the war, some sort of settlement between them that will lead to a lasting peace, which is usually memorialized or formalized in what's called a peace treaty. So you start with an armistice or a ceasefire, and then you negotiate, hopefully, a peace treaty that establishes a permanent peace settlement. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you don't get a permanent peace settlement, and the armistice or ceasefire period comes to an end, and the armies start fighting each other again. But in the case of World War I, the armistice did lead to a permanent peace settlement. So the armistice was requested by the German government. After the Kaiser Wilhelm, had been overthrown and replaced by a council of leaders who pledged to make Germany into a sort of a democratic government, that group of people requested that their generals ask the Allied generals for a ceasefire. And over a period of several hours, the terms of that ceasefire or armistice were negotiated. And the World War I armistice began at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. In this case, the armistice did, as a matter of fact, open up a window in which a permanent peace treaty was negotiated. So people remember the armistice as the end of the First World War. They remember November 11th, 1918 as the day that the First World War ended. And as a matter of fact, for many years in our country, that day, November 11th, was referred to as Armistice Day. And it was a day to honor the veterans of the First World War. Now, over time, as America has fought additional wars, the name of Armistice Day has been changed to Veterans Day. And it is a day when we honor the veterans of all wars. But the day is still November 11th. It's one of the few national holidays whose date does not change. Most of the national holidays in the United States, the date changes so that it always comes on a Monday. So Labor Day, always on a Monday. Memorial Day, always on a Monday. President's Day, Martin Luther King Day, always on Mondays. But there are two national holidays in the United States where the date never changes. Veterans Day, which is always November 11th, and Independence Day, which is always the 4th of July. Okay, so we have an armistice, and for all intents and purposes, it brought about an end to the war. But to formalize that end to the war, you're going to have some sort of negotiation of a peace treaty. And that negotiation took place in the city of Paris, starting in January 1919. So the armistice began November 11th, 1918. The Paris Peace Conference began in January of 1919. And now I'm at the bottom of page 18. Now, although the leaders of all of the countries that were at war with the Central Powers, all of the countries that were at war with Germany and its allies, were represented at the Paris Peace Conference, there were really four who dominated the proceedings, and they were referred to as the Big Four. The Big Four were David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or Britain, if you prefer; Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy; Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France; and Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. And you can see that Woodrow Wilson was quite a tall man. Now, these four men came into the Paris Peace Conference with different ideas about what the conference should be about and what the peace treaty should look like, what the peace settlement should look like. Woodrow Wilson, coming into the Paris Peace Conference, believed that that it should be a very non-traditional kind of treaty. In a traditional treaty, what happens is the losers give up some land and the winners gain land. In all the European wars prior to this time, that was pretty much the way that a peace treaty worked out. The country that had won the war gained land which they took from the country that lost the war. But Woodrow Wilson believed that this peace settlement should be different from that. For one thing, Wilson believed that the First World War had not been caused by any one country, or even any one group of countries. Rather, President Wilson believed that the war had come about as a result of a variety of factors, many of which were beyond the control of any particular country, and that these factors all stemmed from a system of international relations, a system by which countries relate to each other that was messed up, that was broken. So Woodrow Wilson tended to blame the First World War on a system of how countries related to each other, rather than on any particular country or group of countries. So for him, the point of the treaty negotiation was not to identify a country to blame and punish them, was not about acquiring land from whatever countries lost the war, but rather it was an opportunity to reshape the whole system of international relations, an opportunity to fix the problems that had caused the First World War and create a system of international relations that would prevent a war like this in the future. And he felt that that was absolutely necessary because this war had been the most devastating catastrophe in the history of humanity. And so for him, the purpose of this peace settlement and the peace conference that was going to produce the settlement was to change the system so that something catastrophic like this could never happen again. So his phrase that he brought to the Paris Peace Conference was peace without victory. That is to say, it was not a peace treaty where the countries that had won the war should claim the prizes of being winners. It should not be mostly about punishing the losers and taking land from them, but rather the peace treaty should be about creating a new international system for preserving peace in the long run, in order that this war, the most catastrophic in history, would be a war to end all wars. Now, President Wilson could afford to look at things this way. I mean, for one thing, he was an academic. He was not a career politician. As a matter of fact, when Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1912, it was the first election he had ever run in. Prior to that time, he was a history professor at various universities, and finally, he was the president of Princeton University. He had served 2 terms as governor of New Jersey, but he had not run in an election for that position. He had been appointed to that position by the state legislature. So when he ran for president in 1912, it was his first election, and he won. He then ran for re-election in 1916 and won. So President Wilson ran in 2 elections, both presidential elections, and he won both of them. Those were the only elections he ever ran in. He was an academic. That was his profession. He was a professor. He was paid to study things, and think about things. And so he tended to look at things from that sort of studious perspective, kind of a distant perspective, taking something and holding it aside in a sort of disconnected way, sort of studying it, examining it. And that's what he had done with this war and with the causes of the war. He had examined it the way that a scientist examines something in a microscope, and he was now proposing solutions. The other reason why he could look at the world this way was, keep in mind, the United States had really only been in the war actively for its last 5 to 6 months. And compared to the British, the French, the United States had suffered relatively significantly fewer casualties. Around 100,000 Americans had died, with another 200,000 injured. But keep in mind, those numbers were surpassed in some cases in one battle by the British and the French. In Verdun at the Somme, they had suffered more dead, more casualties than the United States had in our entire period of the war. No American territory had been threatened by German or Central Powers invasion. The United States had not been bankrupted by the war. Our national life had not been disrupted so much by the war. And so with the Germans with an ocean separating us from our enemies, Wilson could afford to look at things this way. David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau were in a very different position. They had been fighting the Germans, the Central Powers, for 4 years. There was an entire nation of British and an entire nation of Frenchmen who were now going to be either not coming back to their families at all because they had been killed, or they would be coming back physically mutilated or psychologically scarred. Their nation's treasuries had been bankrupted. In the case of France, the countryside had been ravaged by war, and so they had an emotional tie to the war and the fighting of the war and the Germans as the enemy that President Wilson didn't have. And so to them, this talk about, we're really not going to blame anyone for the war, and therefore the peace treaty should be about something other than punishing another country or taking things from another country. That sounded absolutely absurd to them. They said, well, of course you can blame somebody for the war. It's Germany. They caused the war. And yes, we're going to punish them. And yes, we're going to take land from them. And so the approach with which Woodrow Wilson came to the Paris Peace Conference was destined to be very different from that which these other 2 men, Lloyd George and Clemenceau, brought. Lloyd George, his party had just won re-election to a majority in Britain's Parliament, in their House of Commons. And the election slogan had been, "Make Germany pay," and also "Hang the Kaiser." So you can see what perspective David Lloyd George was coming from. He certainly believed that Germany should be made to pay for its role in starting the war and in fighting the war. Georges Clemenceau, he had once said that he hoped that when he died, he would be buried upright facing Germany, so that even in death he could confront the Germans. And he told his advisors before leaving for the peace conference, I intend to squeeze the Germans like a turnip, which I don't know what you get when you squeeze a turnip juice, I suppose. But again, you get the idea. Neither Lloyd George nor Clemenceau shared Wilson's view that this should mostly be about trying to recreate conditions in the world in order to promote future peace, and it should not primarily be about punishing and taking land from Germany. They didn't see it that way at all. They were intent on punishing Germany. They blamed Germany for the war, and they did absolutely intend to punish them and take land from them and disarm them. Now, as for Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy, He was there largely because he was trying to claim land for Italy. For him, this was to be a traditional peace treaty. If you remember, the reason why Italy joined the Allied powers back in the spring of 1915 was that the British and French had promised Italy that if they joined the Allied powers and Germany and Austria-Hungary were defeated, then Italy would gain in land called the Irredenta, land where Italians lived, but which was not yet part of Italy. This was land that was located sort of in Austria-Hungary. So they would be taking this land from Austria-Hungary. It would now become part of Italy. So Vittorio Orlando was really in Paris there to cash in on that promise, to get for Italy what he felt Italy had been promised by the Allied powers now that the Allies had won the war. So you see, they all came in with very different perspectives. Lloyd George and Clemenceau determined to punish Germany, disarm Germany, take land from Germany. Orlando there to get as much land as he could for Italy. Woodrow Wilson there to try to reshape the system of international relations, not really to punish any country at all, because he didn't believe that any one country had been the cause of the war. You'll notice that I haven't mentioned representatives from two rather important countries. One would be Russia. The Russians had no representative at the Paris Peace Conference because even though they had been a major participant in the war, remember, they were no longer in the war at the end. The Russians, after Lenin took over, the Bolshevik communists, Lenin took over, they had already negotiated a peace treaty with Germany. And so as far as the other Allied powers were concerned, Russia had given up its right to be represented at this peace conference. Bolshevik Russia had dropped out of the war, had lost the war, had surrendered to the Germans. The territory which Russia had given up to Germany was now, as far as the Allied powers were concerned, it was vacated territory. It belonged to neither Russia nor Germany, and they could do with it what they chose. So Russia will have no representative. Germany will also have no representative at the Paris Peace Conference. This made this a rather different kind of peace conference in that in a typical peace conference, you would have it would be a negotiated peace. The winners and the losers would come together and they would negotiate a peace between them. But that's not what's going to happen here. What's going to happen here is the Allied powers, the victorious Allied powers, they're going to negotiate the terms of the peace treaty, and then they're going to cram it down the Germans' throat. They're going to impose it. So this will not be a negotiated peace with the Germans. It will be a peace that will be imposed on the Germans. So already that doesn't look good for the Germans. So now, I want to focus in section 13 a little bit about President Wilson's approach to the peace treaty, because rightly or wrongly, it became the sort of basis around which a lot of the peace treaty was negotiated. So President Wilson had established something called the 14 points. And in section 13, I want you to be able to explain how President Wilson's 14 points were supposed to prevent a future war, but why many of them were not actually included in the final treaty that ended the war with Germany, that is, the Treaty of Versailles. So, items to know, the 14 points, self-determination, the League of Nations, and the Treaty of Versailles. And I'm taking you to page 19, and you'll notice that what I've done here is I have listed what became known as Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. I've listed 13 out of them on page 19. The 14th will appear on page 20. And you'll see that I've given a little box here and then a slightly larger box here. The little box is for you to write whether the Allied powers accepted these points or rejected them or compromised. Okay, so you could put a little A if it was accepted, or a check mark if it was accepted. You could put an R for rejected, or an X for rejected, or you could put a C for compromised. Okay, and then this is to provide you just a little space to take some notes on what this meant and why it was accepted or rejected or compromised. So some of these we'll talk about a little bit more, and some of them we'll talk about less. So remember what I said about President Wilson. He believed that no country had actually caused the war, but rather that the system of international relations, the system by which countries related to each other, was messed up, was broken, and that's what had caused the war. And so, what Wilson did, having studied all of the causes of the war, as a studious academic type would, he now presented a plan, and this plan had 14 ideas, 14 points, a 14-point plan for trying to fix all the things that were broken about that system so that these things would not cause another catastrophic war. So if you look at the 14 points, each one of them is meant to address one of the factors that had helped to cause the war. And it was meant to fix that factor so that it would not cause a future war. Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, was shocked by this. He said, God himself only gave us 10 commandments. Wilson has 14. We don't obey the ones that God gave us. The 10 that God gave us, we don't obey. We'll see about Wilson's 14, right? So let's see what we've got here. So the first point of Wilson's 14 points, open covenants of peace openly arrived at, which is a fancy way of saying there should be no secret alliances. Well, had secret alliances contributed to the outbreak of the war? Yeah, clearly they had. The secret alliance between Russia and Serbia, for example, had contributed to the outbreak of the war because it left Austria guessing whether they would be facing only Serbia in war or Serbia and Russia. And Serbia's ties to Russia most definitely helped to bring about the war because Austria-Hungary went scrambling off to get German help in order to balance off against the help that Russia had provided to Serbia. Austria's connection to Germany through the Triple Alliance is another example. Britain's protection of Belgium via an alliance. Now, that wasn't a secret alliance. But you get the idea. Alliances had been a contributor to the cause of the war. And so President Wilson proposed that there should be no secret alliances, and that when there were alliances, they should be open to any country. They should not pit countries against each other. Well, this point was rejected. It was rejected by the British and the French because, and so you could put a little R in this box here if you wanted, or an X, whatever you want to do. It was rejected by the British and the French because the British and French said, look, we may agree to this, and we may not enter into any secret alliances with other countries, but we do not trust Germany to do that. We do not trust Germany, and if we are not entering into secret alliances, but the Germans are, that puts us at a disadvantage. So the British and French rejected Wilson's first point. All right, how about absolute freedom of the seas? Wilson said that even during times of war, countries that are not involved in the war, neutral countries, like the United States had been, should be allowed to trade freely on the seas. There should be no blockades, there should be no submarine warfare. And of course, this had not exactly been a cause of the war itself, but it had been the cause of the United States joining the war. And so Wilson proposed that even during times of war, there should be absolute freedom of the seas, particularly for neutral countries. This point was rejected as well. So again, you can put a little R in the little box or an X or whatever you want. It was rejected primarily by the British. The British had the strongest navy in the world, and there was no way that they were going to give up the right to use that navy to blockade their enemies during times of war. It had helped to cripple Germany in the war. The British blockade was a contributor to Germany losing the war. That was a weapon, naval blockades, that the British were not willing to give up. So this point was rejected as well. Number 3, I don't want to spend a lot of time with, removal of trade barriers. Woodrow Wilson pointed out that countries that trade with each other tend not to go to war with each other. Because when they trade with each other, they become dependent on each other for products. And once that interdependence builds up between them, it becomes really complicated and problematic to go to war. Because when you go to war with someone, you lose access to the products that you were getting from them. And so by removing anything that was slowing down trade and allowing trade to flow freely and increasing trade between countries, that would help to decrease the likelihood of war. And so President Wilson proposed this as the third of his 14 points. This one was also rejected Primarily by the French. There were products that are unique in France, like wine, that they didn't want to have to compete with other countries. They didn't want Italians or Spanish importing wine into France and running the French winemakers out of business. And so they rejected this. So Wilson's third point was rejected as well. The fourth point, reduction of arms to defensive levels. So basically, what Woodrow Wilson was saying in here is it takes a lot more weapons to invade another country than to simply be prepared to defend your own country from invasion. Um, as we saw in this war, it's a lot easier to play defense than to play offense. You can play defense with a lot fewer weapons than it takes to go on the offensive and successfully attack somebody. So Wilson proposed that all the countries of the world should disarm themselves to a level where they had enough weapons to protect themselves from invasion, but not enough weapons to successfully invade another country. And if you did that, if all the countries reduced their weapons to a defensive level, that would decrease the likelihood of wars breaking out. Well, this point was rejected also, for the same reason as the first. The British and French said, well, we might reduce our arms to defensive levels. We might reduce the amount of weapons we possess to defensive levels, but we don't trust the Germans to do that. And if we reduce our weapons to that level and the Germans don't, that puts us at a disadvantage. So we reject this point as well. The fifth point, impartial adjustment of colonial claims. That's a fancy way of saying, of Woodrow Wilson saying that there were nations of people in the world who had been conquered and were being ruled over by other nations as a result of imperialism, right? As a result of European countries going out and building up empires, and even the United States to a lesser extent doing that. And Wilson proposed that there ought to be a wide open discussion about freeing some of those nations of people who had been conquered by the European nations and incorporated into their empires. Wilson felt that imperialism had been a cause of the war. Certainly, the race of the European countries against each other to build up empires had created tensions that contributed to the war. And so he proposed that the age of imperialism should sort of come to an end. Well, this point was rejected. It was rejected by both the British and the French. The British and the French had both built up large global empires. They relied on their colonies for certain valuable raw materials. They relied on their colonies to act as markets for their finished goods. And it simply was not something they were willing to do to open up the possibility of giving up any part of their empires. So this point was rejected as well. Now we get to point number 6, removal of foreign troops from Russia. And I haven't really explained to you about foreign troops in Russia. After the Russian Revolution, soldiers from Britain, France, Italy, the United States, Japan, that is the Allied powers, actually invaded Russia in an effort to get back some of the war supplies that they had provided to the Russians during the war. At the time that this treaty was being negotiated, some of those Allied soldiers remained in Russia. And we'll get into this again in the next unit when we talk about the Russian Revolution. And Wilson was proposing that all the Allied powers remove their troops from Russia. This too was rejected. The British and French and Italians all rejected this point because they intended to keep their soldiers in Russia until they had gotten back the supplies that they had sent to the Russians. So look at how this has gone. There are 14 points, and all of Wilson's first 6 points were rejected by either Britain or France or both. So Wilson's plan to sort of reshape the system of international relations in a way that would prevent future wars seemed to be falling apart from the very beginning. The British and the French had a very different view of what this peace treaty and this peace process should be about. And as a result, they didn't value this idea of reshaping the system to create peace the same way that Wilson did. particularly if it meant giving up things that were important to them. The British were not about to give up their power over the seas, their power to blockade their enemies during times of war. They weren't about to give up their empire, because those were too valuable. The French were not about to give up the right to control trade and put up barriers to trade to protect their own products, and they weren't about to give up their colonial empire either. Neither of them was going to give up the right to have secret treaties and build up their weapons, above and beyond the level of a defensive level, because they didn't trust the Germans to do the same. And so as a result, all of these points of Woodrow Wilson's were rejected. 6 points, 6 rejects. That's ugly. Let's look at number 7, the removal of foreign troops from Belgium. Now there was something that the Allies could agree to. If you remember, this was the entire reason why Britain entered the war, was Germany's invasion of Belgium and Britain's determination to keep Belgium free of hostile soldiers, to keep Belgium independent and neutral. So the Germans had occupied Belgium since the beginning of the war. Woodrow Wilson called for the removal of foreign troops from Belgium, the restoration of Belgium's independence and neutrality. This was something the Allies could agree to, and they did. So finally, after putting R's or X's in all these boxes, you can put a letter A or maybe a check mark in that box to show that it was accepted by the other Allied powers, and it became part of the Treaty of Versailles. Point 8, Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. You remember that Alsace-Lorraine was this territory in the eastern part of France where roughly half of the people living there were French, ethnically French, and about half were German. It had been part of France until 1871, when, after the Franco-Prussian War, and France's humiliation and defeat in that war, it was stripped of them by the Germans, incorporated as part of Germany. Now Woodrow Wilson proposed that that territory be returned to France. This too was accepted. This was something the Allies could get around. This, honestly, was the main reason why France was hostile to Germany, was to take revenge for their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 and to get back Alsace-Lorraine. So point 8 was also accepted. And now we get into, that little window, that little yellow spot should only go up from 9 through 13. It shouldn't include 8, although it partially is. The reason why I've grouped 9 through 13 together is all of these relate to the issue of nationalism. So remember that nationalism was seen by President Wilson as one of the major causes of the war. And you can think to yourself and say, yeah, it really was a major cause of the war. It was Serb nationalism, specifically nationalism amongst the Bosnian Serbs living in Bosnia under the control of Austria-Hungary, that led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, which was the sort of igniting event of the war. So remember, nationalism is the desire of a nation of people to rule themselves. Or if you prefer, it's the desire of a nation of people to have their own state, their own government, independent, self-governing, not ruled by outsiders or foreigners. And so clearly, nationalism had been a major cause of the war. Serb nationalism specifically, but nationalism more generally. And so President Wilson proposed that nationalism had to be dealt with. And really, all of these issues, 9 through 13, they all relate in one way or another to nationalism. Point 9, a readjustment of Italy's borders so that more Italians were living under the control of Italy. That's why Vittorio Orlando was there. Number 10, states for the nations of Austria-Hungary. You might remember that Austria-Hungary was an empire ruled by a German family, the Habsburgs, but most people of that empire were not ethnically German. Number 11, removal of foreign troops from the Balkans. That has to do with Serbia as well. Number 12, states for the nations of the Ottoman Empire. Again, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by people who were Turkish, but most of the people of the Ottoman Empire were not Turkish. Remember the Arabs, for example, or the Armenians. And then number 13, the establishment of an independent Poland, a state for the Polish nation. So points 9 through 13 all were related to the issue of nationalism, which had been a major cause of the war. And the solution that President Wilson proposed to this was self-determination, which then is allowing each nation to govern itself, allowing each nation to have its own state. So if nationalism is the desire of each nation to govern itself, to not be governed by outsiders, to have its own state, its own independent government, if nationalism is the desire for that, then the antidote, the solution for that problem is self-determination. Well, then, let us allow each nation to govern itself. Let us allow each nation to have its own state. So the question is, were these proposals of Woodrow Wilson accepted, compromised, or rejected? Well, some were accepted, and some were compromised. None were fully rejected. So here is a map of Europe prior to the First World War. This is the one that we've been using. And here is a map of what Europe looked like after the First World War. Take a few minutes, not a few minutes, take 10 seconds or so and look at the two maps and look for how things changed in between the beginning of the war and the end of the war. So one thing you might notice is there's Poland. So point number 13, the establishment of an independent Poland, a state for the Polish people, that was accepted by the Allied powers, and Poland as an independent state was created. Down here in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey became a new state that was for the Turks. But then there were other states that were created at that time for the Arabs. The kingdom, what is today the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, was established for the Arabs. Many other Arabs, however, ended up living not under their own governance, but under the rule of Britain and France. Big parts of the Ottoman Empire were created as what were called mandates. And a mandate is a territory that is governed by a country for a certain amount of time until that country deems that the people living there are ready to govern themselves. So other than Saudi Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia, most of the Arab people ended up as a mandate of Britain or a mandate of France. The British and French did not consider that most of the Arabs to be prepared for self-government, and so they took over their portions of the Ottoman Empire and ruled them, the idea being that after a time they would give them their independence. So that is a sort of a compromise, that not quite accepted, not quite rejected. For many of the Arabs, they did not receive independent, self-governing state immediately. And then with regard to Austria-Hungary, you might see here that Austria-Hungary's empire, big chunks of it, so Austria becomes an independent state, a much smaller one. Hungary gets its own independent state. But then you see these things called Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So Czechoslovakia was made up of two different nations of people, the Czechs and the Slovaks. Yugoslavia was made up of a dozen different nations of people, Croats and Slovenes and Serbs and Montenegrins and Bosnians. And notice how they are all sort of grouped in. So Czechoslovakia, Czechs and Slovaks combined into one. Yugoslavia, all these Southern Slavic people combined into one state. Yugoslavia, literally land of the South Slavs. The reason why this happened is that the British and French didn't like the idea of giving all those nations their own separate independent states. If they did, they would be small states, and therefore vulnerable to being invaded and conquered. By whom? Well, from the British and French perspective, by Germany, of course. And so instead of allowing the various nations to have their own states, they wanted to see those smaller states combined into larger ones. So the Czechs and Slovaks combined into Czechoslovakia, a larger state that would be more able to defend itself against a potential German invasion. Yugoslavia, all these different nations of Slavs combined into one state that would be bigger and stronger and more capable of defending itself. Now, today, you might know that all those nations do have their own states. So the map of the world, or the map of Europe today, looks much more like the map that Woodrow Wilson would have intended back in 1919. But for the moment, those nations were not given their own states, they were combined together. As for Italy, the Italians really expected to get a lot more land than they ended up getting. Notice they get a little nub here and a little nub here, and that's about it. The Italians were really disappointed by the amount of land that they got. They felt that they got a lot less land out of this deal than was promised to them by the Allied powers when they first joined the Allies back in 1915. And so the Italians Vittorio Orlando stormed out of this conference, feeling like Italy had been shortchanged. So you see what I mean? These points 9 through 13, which were meant to address nationalism, most of them were sort of partially accepted. Poland fully accepted, the other ones kind of partially accepted or compromised. Now, the reason why Woodrow Wilson was willing to agree to all of these, to give up so many of his 14 points or to compromise others, was that the 14th point was to him the most valuable. It was the key to the entire future of the world. And he was willing to give up on these others to get the support of Britain and France for this 14th point. And that we'll have to deal with in our next lesson. So the 14th point, the creation of the League of Nations, will be the focus of the first part of our next lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves. Try to stay healthy, try to stay safe. I look forward to teaching you our next lesson. So goodbye, everybody.